I am so excited to have so many of you join us this evening. I'm going to get our slides pulled up and introduce myself, and we'll get things started promptly this evening. So thank you everybody for joining me. My name is Reverend Catherine Sherrill. I am a deacon here in the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church, and I serve at Sanctuary Counseling Group in Charlotte, North Carolina as a licensed clinical mental health counselor and pastoral counselor. I'm also a board certified music therapist for all of the acronyms under my name. That about covers it. But I have a specialization in treating individuals ages about 12 to 13 to adults with anxiety, complex grief, and trauma, specifically with religious trauma in my experience. And I am so glad to be able to be with you guys tonight and to share these things that hopefully can be very helpful to you all looking to become more trauma informed in your ministry practice in your congregations for welcoming people from a variety of different backgrounds and settings. I'm going to briefly turn things over to Katie so that she can give us some kind of tips and things as we're going to move through this evening, but I'm really excited to be with you all.
Well, welcome. So this evening I am going to be monitoring our chat. So as Catherine goes through her presentation, if you have questions that come up, just go ahead and send those in the chat. And then if she does a Q&A there at the end, we'll make sure we capture those. If you have any questions or problems, again, share those in the chat. We have everybody kept on mute just to minimize background noise. And yeah, and if she's got a couple of videos to share, I trust that she's done it properly, but and on the chance that you can't hear any sound, you just let me know. And I'm just here to help you however I can.
Thank you so much, Katie. So we'll jump right in this morning. I told Katie, the time we have is the time we have. If it's short, it's short. If it's on time, it's on time. So we'll get going. So to start off this evening, a couple of things that I'm going to be covering with us all is, first off, a working definition of what is trauma. This is definitely an area that I probably get asked the most about when I'm doing congregational care and working with churches, is just trying to understand this big thing that we know as trauma. There are many different types, and kind of from our experience that we know from the past to what's the working definition now that we see counselors, psychotherapists, ministers working off of now to be able to care for such a diverse need group. The second is going into, how does it affect ministry and why does it affect ministry? Why can sometimes individuals or communities that have experienced trauma, why is it hard for them sometimes to effectively do ministry together? And the final one is ideas for working with this population, and hopefully using my own knowledge and guidance to hopefully give you all some tips so that way you can bring it back to your communities and share, and us really just work together to invite all of the diversity of God's creation into our communities. So we're going to start things off with a question. Katie is going to throw the link in the chat here. This is called a Menti. It's a thing that I did not know about until my friend showed me. So she's sending you a link if you want to pull it up in another browser and enter the code there. And all you're going to do is just say, what do you think of when you hear trauma? What words come to mind, things like that, and we're going to kind of work together to come up with at least our gathered group here right now. What's our understanding of trauma? What do we think about?
All right, sorry, I got it now. I had one job And I forgot. There it is. Okay. So there's the link and you see the access code. So you can just access this right here.
As everyone is putting things in the chat, some common themes that are showing up are harm to individuals, abuse, hurt, pain, suffering. Seeing a lot of fear. Also talking about how, it may be related to one situation, but we're experiencing it in another. And really, things that are overwhelming or stressful. And as we talk about these responses specifically, something that I talk about with churches when we start with this working definition is branching this out. We've all kind of known or have some experience in our life with what trauma is, what it looks like in individuals. But sometimes it can be hard to really understand what it looks like until the moment that it's happening. And that can be really challenging for us as leaders to be able to walk through with people when maybe there's other people in the room with us. Maybe there's a lot going on, and how we're reacting, how we're responding also makes a difference. So working off the definition that we, are all sharing, these are a couple of things that I want to share about trauma. Most commonly, when we talk about trauma, people bring up the psychiatric condition of trauma, which we have as post-traumatic stress disorder. People know this disorder. This is not a new thing in the DSM. We've had it almost as, since the DSM was created, all the way back from World Wars, when we really started trying to hone this definition of what they then called shell-shocked. And PTSD now in the DSM is defined as a disorder that occurs in people who have experienced or witnessed a traumatic event and the series of events or sets of circumstances too. And this person may experience this event as emotionally or physically harmful or life-threatening. And it can affect mental, physical, social, and for us in this community, a very important thing to talk about is spiritual well-being. We're really looking at post-traumatic stress as what we call a biopsychosocial disorder. It doesn't affect just one system of the body's functioning, it affects all of them. And something that I talk to people about, trauma, it's a comment I often hear is that, well, everybody, talks about trauma nowadays. What are we talking about? What we're talking about is something with outside of normal parameters. We have a reasonable expectation of what happens in people's lives. But that reasonable expectation is often broken. In 2019, if we were having this conversation, we had a reasonable expectation of parameters of what life would look like if a global pandemic happened. We don't have those same expectations anymore. We all went through something that was a collective trauma. And individuals within that collective trauma then had variety and vast amount of experiences with that. And the most important thing that I'm going to talk about in this is that trauma changes the brain. This is why PTSD, trauma responses, things like that are so difficult to heal from, is that it fundamentally changes how our brain functions. And with that change, we don't respond the same way that we used to. And this is where, we talk about empathy and for these individuals, for ourselves, because it feels like something at times when I sit with clients who have extensive trauma histories, they talk about often, I just feel like I'm not even in control. Like I'm almost watching something happen. And I don't understand why I'm doing this, is often what they reflect to me. And for us to really share this, that, yeah, it probably doesn't make a lot of sense. because we have had a fundamental change in how our neurology is responding to this. I'm going to play us now a short video. I am going to try to turn on closed captioning, and you can let Katie know if the audio is funky. I think I'm in a good spot. But I am going to share an interview with Bessel van der Kolk. He is the author of The Body Keeps the Score. He is one of the world's foremost experts in trauma, a phenomenal neuroscientist and psychiatrist. And he really does an incredible amount of explaining trauma, and wanted to just share this interview with him. It was very, very well done, so that we can hear from one of the masters himself on this topic.
Trauma is so ubiquitous that if you think you have never seen it, you have not looked. We meet people who fly off the handle. We meet people who shut down. We meet people who are very difficult. No, it is a rare family that doesn't have a drug addict, alcoholic, disturbed person. You know, one thing I like to say when I give a lecture, are there any normal people who come from normal families in the audience? And sometimes one or two people raise their hands and say, can I please come to your family for Thanksgiving? Because I've never been to a normal family. My name is Bessel van der Kolk. I'm a psychiatrist, neuroscientist. I have been studying trauma for about 50 years now. I've treated a whole variety of different traumatized populations, see trauma in many different countries around the world, and I am the author of the book, The Body Keeps the Score. It's important for people to realize that not every mental health professional knows what we're talking about here. The mainstream system of psychiatry, psychology is that there is something wrong with you and I need to fix you. That's a very different attitude than dealing with trauma. Around that time that I first started to work for the VA, a group of us started to define what trauma is and started to define what happens to people. 1978 was the year, and the Vietnam War was over by about 6 or 7 years. The very first day that I met Vietnam veterans, I was just blown away. They kept referring back to their dead comrades. Their hearts seemed to be with the people who were no longer around. They had a hard time loving their wives and girlfriends. They had a hard time being in any way meaningfully involved in the present. These were guys who were my age, who were smart and competent, but they clearly were just a shadow of their former self. And what was also really striking is they were sort of passive much of the time, and then people told them something that was disappointing, and they went from 0 to 10 and blew up and became extremely angry. Something seemed to have happened to them that made it very hard for them to modulate their responses to the environment. My colleagues and I started to think about how is what these guys suffer from different from what other people who are in psychiatry textbooks suffer from. So I dug up a book that was written in 1941 by Abram Gardner, who had been working with World War soldiers. He writes, these guys suffer from a physioneurosis. Their bodies continue to re-experience that very terrible, frightening situation. And that event keeps coming back in terms of images, behaviors, and physical sensations. So that became the core of our definition of PTSD. We write, these people have been exposed to an extraordinary event that's outside of normal human experience. And in retrospect, that shows us how ignorant and narrow-minded we were, because it turned out that this is not an unusual experience at all. Trauma is actually unlike what we first thought. extremely common. 1 out of 5 women in America has a history of sexual molestation. Even a lot of men have histories of sexual molestation. 1 out of 4 kids get beaten very hard by their parents. 1 out of 8 kids see physical fights between their parents. People usually think about the military when they talk about trauma, but when we started to work with inner city kids, the amount of trauma that these kids experienced was just unspeakable. The nature of trauma is that an experience enters into your ears, into your skin, into your eyes, and it goes down into a very primitive part of your brain that automatically interprets what is going on. Is this dangerous or is this safe? An event becomes traumatic when there is nothing you can do to stave off the inevitable, and your body starts automatically going into a state of fight, flight, or collapse. The lingering effect of trauma is that you continue to react to mild stressors as if your life is in danger. And so you tend to become hyper-reactive. Somebody may irritate you in the supermarket. You may develop road rage. You may have a difficult time putting up with misbehavior from your spouse or your kids. And most people actually are barely aware or not aware at all that their reactions that they're having right now are actually rooted in experiences they have had before. That event itself is over, but you continue to react to things as if you're in danger. So the big challenge of treating trauma is how do we help people to live in bodies that feel fundamentally safe? The tradition in mental health is to dismiss the reality of people's lives. For example, it's only in the past few years that people are beginning to talk about the impact of poverty, or the impact of racism, or the impact of unemployment. And people have sort of been labeling people, oh, there's something wrong with you, let me fix you. But if you go to a physician or a mental health practitioner who doesn't understand that, they're going to try to fix you with drugs or cognitive behavioral treatment to not do these crazy things anymore. It usually doesn't work very well. But what's very clear is that being in a relationship where people can hear you, where you can talk about how badly you feel, where you can talk about your guilt, and where you can start opening up where these feelings come from, how old these feelings are, and how you develop these feelings in response to particular things that happen to you, that was actually quite helpful. Because you need to really develop a deep sense of, this is what happened to me. This is what I'm dealing with. And I need to take care of the wounds that I'm carrying inside of myself. This issue of self-compassion and really knowing that your reactions are understandable and are rooted in you getting stuck in the past is a terribly important part of beginning to recover from trauma. Most of us are survivors of one thing or another, some much worse than others. And so if people say, what do you wish your legacy were? They say, I want our society to know about trauma and to really do all the things that are necessary so that people who grow up under extreme adverse conditions can develop a brain and a mind that can help them to become full-fledged members of society. That's our big issue, and that's the big challenge that we have.
Dr. van der Kolk does an amazing job of explaining, from his research, an uncomfortable truth that him and his fellow colleagues discovered the longer that they worked in trauma, and one that much of the mental health and society are coming to terms with, was that we used to think that trauma was this unique or rare event, that really only these circumstances would happen to maybe a few. We need to know how to treat it. We need to know how to help those. But the uncomfortable truth became that it was a lot more common than we realized. In fact, it was incredibly common. You heard some of his statistics. This video is a couple of years old. And from the results of the COVID pandemic, we are still redoing some of these results. But the American Psychological Association and American Medical Association is now seeing a sharp increase in some of these numbers. Still, approximately 1 out of 4 to 5 women, and sometimes it's a higher proportion. It's less men, but of course, men as well experiencing sexual abuse. It is 1 out of 4 children instead of 1 out of 5 that will experience physical harm from an adult figure. And 1 out of 4 in general, people will experience an acute mental health episode at some point in their life. The truth is that if you're curious if trauma exists in your congregation, it's already there. We think about these communities that we gather together. Statistically, they could be sitting right next to you. And we may not even be aware. The truth is that trauma changes us. That's really what we're talking about when I'm looking to educate people on trauma and how we become trauma informed, is really coming to this understanding that the people that we were before these events, we are not exactly those same people anymore. And Dr. Vanderkolk went briefly into this, and I am not going to, I promise, give you guys a lesson in neuropsychology here, but this is a very rudimentary example of the brain, and I do want to talk about this area. This is where I work extensively with people, is understanding exactly when I say trauma changes us, and I said, earlier in my presentation that it changes our brain. This is what we're talking about. We're talking about this internal system. Dr. Vanderkolk in his books calls this system the cockroach brain. It is the oldest part of our brain. This part, this kind of curly Q yellow part in the middle here, down to our brain stem, most organisms have. And it does an incredibly simple but beautiful function of fight, flight, or freeze. Now, why is it, so old and so important? Well, here's the thing. Before we had this beautiful pink part up here, this cerebral cortex that, we beautifully have as humans, this middle part of our brain was very, very important. It's very, very important today. If sitting in your homes or your churches right now, if a bear walked in, I would hope this yellow part of your brain would kick on immediately, because we've got to make a life or death decision. What are we going to do? And this fires to every part of our brain. That's why it is so centrally located. Fires not only to our brain, but to our nervous system, to get our feet moving, to decide if that window is possible to jump through all of these kind of things. We make a split-second decision. And this whole system is fueled by cortisol most of all. And when people start to talk to me about, well, what does trauma really do? You say it changes the brain. What it does is that over time, we know an overproduction of cortisol or introduction of cortisol to the brain system in large and slightly. We're not talking about massive differences, but the slightest thing can make a whole difference when we're talking about the brain. This curly Q system right in the middle, the amygdala, grows slightly. And when it does, all of a sudden, it's so much more sensitive. Instead of, you can hear the sirens outside my window right now, instead of me passively thinking, I'm outside a really busy street right now, I think, well, what's happening? What's wrong? Where am I going? Is that siren for me? Is this? And immediately the thoughts start kicking off. You can also tell that this curlicue system here, it touches so many really important functions of the brain, from our brainstem that communicates things down to our nervous system, to our memory and our sense of balance, or where are we in time and space in our hippocampus and cerebellum, to our pituitary gland. Are we, is our heart racing? Is our breath okay? And the other place that it sadly is very, very far away from is this prefrontal cortex, which is where all our decision making happens. And if this is going a million miles an hour, very few signals are really getting up where they need to, where we can make a very, very calm, understood decision. And people that have experienced trauma, and we'll talk about, well, how do you heal this system or things like that? And by the glory of God, we are learning about this and having tools for people nowadays. But this system is so delicate. And that's why Van der Kolk calls it the cockroach brain. It's very, very old. It wasn't really designed to live in a world of constant stress and triggers and things. It's very old. For people that say, like, I'm an old soul, we all are in some ways through that. So we're going to talk about now trauma and ministry. We have an understanding of what it is, how it functions in our brain, and all of those kind of places that we're seeing right there. So common trauma sources in churches. These are 4 of many. And even as I was sitting here watching Dr. Van der Kolk's, I was like, oh, I forgot a really important one. So I'll touch on that too on this. The first one for churches is obviously religious trauma. People come to our congregations with a vast amount of experiences of God and religious bodies, religious leaders, everything that happens in the name of divine beings to us as people that are trying to follow as followers of, in our tradition, of Christ, of God. And this is a very key area. I mentioned this is one of my specializations. I work a lot with the LGBTQIA population within religious trauma. Many of them having experiences with conversion programs that were supported by many religious organizations. Another big area that I see, and this one has been definitely increasing, especially with the disaffiliation process of the United Methodist Church, relational trauma, losing loved ones. Someone in our chat, talked about relational trauma, as unprocessed grief. This is very, very true. Losing loved ones, friends, drama in churches in which people leave or feel forced out can really make a challenge of joining a new community. When we've been so hurt from a relational aspect, it's very hard then to come back into a new place and feel ready to engage in that kind of closeness with another community. Another is abuse and neglect. Many people in our churches have experienced abuse, neglect, sexual violence, and other experiences. Like Dr. Van der Kolk said, this is incredibly common, and these are experiences that people don't openly share very often, that they have in their past. And many, churches that I work with, ask, how do we support these people in our communities? We know that they exist, but this isn't a topic that we often talk about in our churches. Another one is socioeconomic. As families that are, as communities that are reaching out to God's most hurting and wounded, we have to talk about people who are facing poverty, food and job insecurity, housing crisis. Also within socioeconomic and ranges are racism. Also aspects of intergenerational trauma. We experience this a lot in churches that have an incredibly strong family dynamic within them, that they have been, part of this community for decades and generations of families, and bring their own set of both graces and sometimes complex trauma. Like I said, this is a short list. These are the ones when I meet with churches that tend to come up the most, but it is not a complete list by any stretch of imagination. The most important thing that, if there is something today that you hear from this presentation, because it has been a lot of things like, do we feel a little bit powerless against how much trauma exists? Is that trauma at its core asks for hope. This is something that is, I'll share after this, that can be increasingly difficult, is when we do see suffering, how to maintain hope for individuals, for ourselves, for our world, and our churches. But hope and trauma are really, really linked together. I'm going to play us one short video from the Trauma Institute here.
What do you think of when you hear the word trauma? You might think of terrible events like violence, abuse, or disaster. When we hear the word trauma, we often think about the cause, but trauma is actually the effect of events like these. Trauma is a wound of the heart and mind that causes deep suffering. It leaves us feeling overwhelmed and disconnected, and it takes a very long time to heal. It hurts every part of us, our relationships, our bodies, our thoughts, and our faith. Often, trauma sends shockwaves through entire families and communities. And because suffering is part of the human experience, we are all vulnerable to trauma. But God is with everyone who suffers. God feels our pain with us, and God wants to help us heal. That is why we have hope. Whenever there is trauma, healing is always possible.
I played this video before, sharing just some of my own personal experiences of working with people with trauma, especially reintegrating into religious communities, because God is an essential element of this. God is not blind or unfeeling to the suffering and the pain that happens in this world. And it can often be a very, very difficult thing for us to wrestle with as Christians, that there can be such suffering, and people can experience such suffering in a world that has God. And working with specifically religious trauma, this can be a really beautiful but difficult tension to carry. Many of my clients, as I spoke before, come from a variety of different backgrounds. My training before I came back here to North Carolina, I was in Chicago. I attended Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary, and I had a privilege while I was there to work for the Center of Religion and Psychotherapy. And they are a trauma center, really focused on religious trauma. I was able to study and work there throughout my education and slightly after through a fellowship program. And many of the people that I spoke of, came from religious experiences, not just Christian based, that had experienced trauma in their time. And there were a lot of common threads that, started popping up. I talked about some of them, of this feeling that things were just really out of my control. I don't know what I did wrong. And there were a variety of reasons why these people were in my office at the end of it. Some of them had left their religious organizations of their own choice. Some of them had been pushed out. Some of them, the organization collapsed around them after accusations or things were found out about the religious leaders themselves. And all of these very, very different experiences had pieces in common. And a big one was people really struggled with everything that had happened with them and the idea of a loving or nurturing God, a God that really cared about their suffering. Many of them would question, I was not doing well for so long. Did no one care? I have vignettes from a client that I worked with that I'm going to share specifically. And she was a worker within a religious body. She found herself joining this group when she was in her early teens. They were a popular ministry option at her university. And when she joined, everything was great. She felt like she finally found a place that she belonged. And through talking and discerning with her small group, she had been struggling in school. She really felt like God was not calling her to higher education, but instead calling her to join this ministry. And so she dropped out of school to full-time pursue a career with this ministry. And she left her friends and family and moved quite far away, states away, to join this ministry full-time. Little did she know that it was not paid. And she found herself not long after joining the ministry homeless. And she asked herself often if she was happy. And when we talk about this time early in the ministry, she reports that she was. I felt like I was serving a higher purpose. Everyone was affirming this call that I was living out. And as time went on, she realized that she never really progressed as promised within the ministry, even though everyone kept telling her how called and gifted she was. And throughout this, she learned that there were many reasons for this. But over time, she described almost leaving the ministry not because she didn't feel called, but because she no longer knew if she was serving God or serving people. At this point, she was in her late 20s, did not have a career or an education, had broken off all contact from friends and family. She was completely isolated when I met her. And us rebuilding, what does it mean to belong to something? She knew that myself and many of our younger interns, that we were all Methodists. And she said, well, should I go to a Methodist church? I said, well, really depends. Because she was desperately looking for someone to care. And naming for herself that she wanted friends, something that she named she never had in her ministry. Time. She had a roommate, but they often struggled together more than anything. Heartbreakingly, I will always remember her telling me the story of one time choosing one week who was going to eat, her and her roommate or the cat that they shared and had adopted. And she looks back on that time and thinks and would often tell me that I just felt so stupid. And I'm afraid if I walked into a church that I would be just as stupid. And so from this, we did a lot of work together. And there's a long history that I won't share of some of her specific traumas that in that 10-year period she had happened to her that fundamentally changed how she was going to engage, if she chose so, to ever be back in a religious body. And this is just one person, but someone very common that could be walking in your front door tomorrow. Many people from all different types of trauma are looking exactly for what my client was, which is community. Dr. van der Kolk spoke about this at the very end. What actually makes an impact on trauma? Relationships. Honest relationships. People that will listen and will encourage us to think, what's happening right now? What happened to us? And how can we heal together? Sometimes this can look in a psychotherapy relationship, as I do with my clients. Sometimes this can be in our own churches, though. People are walking in just trying to find relationship. And there's a lot of different levels of this relationship that we can offer, but we have to be informed. We have to be ready to accept all that this may be. And this is often the conversation that I get in with congregations, is that they want to help these individuals, but they quickly feel overwhelmed by knowing how. So let's work together. We talk about in counseling, in theology, we talk about lenses. So we're going to walk together through a trauma-informed lens. Dr. van der Kolk talked about this recently. Us being psychotherapists, really tuned into the impact of socioeconomic and racial factors. That is the post-colonial lens. And this led to the trauma-informed lens. No one is normal. This is maybe the truest thing I will say all evening for you all. Dr. van der Kolk spoke of this, and I did as well. We've always defined trauma as people that have experienced something outside the realm of normal human experience. Well, I don't know about you guys, but I have missed the boat on normal human experience the last couple of years. It's been a wild ride for a lot of people. And it's accepting this as truth. If we start to kind of name that our whole congregation, no one is normal, we're just a lot of people trying to figure it out, we become much more capable of these two facets. The first is affirming a diverse life experience. Everyone, every single person in your church has something to teach. Experiences that could really shape and change how your church does ministry. The one danger of this, or caveat that I put, is being mindful about not making people spokespeople for a certain life experience. I had a very, very good friend who in her ministry context was the only woman in a meeting full of older men who were ecstatic to have a young 20-year-old ready to do church ministry. And, they talked about growing the church and things like that. And, as soon as they were like, well, we want to do this, how does it sound? And the whole room would swivel and turn to her and be like, tell us everything. And she would admit, she's like, I don't know. I walked to this church, or I came to this church because it was the only one on the bus line. So that's why I'm here. And many people feel this pressure when they do come from this diverse life experience to be this spokesperson from individuals, encouraging us to be mindful of this. Everyone has something to give. Sometimes this is placing the ability for people to give suggestions without having to stand up in front of a bunch of people or to talk about exactly why they think that's a terrible idea. Maybe because they come from a different context. But this is a challenging thing when truly we want to learn from everyone in our churches. And if we accept that no one is normal, that we're all just trying to figure it out, we can emphasize empathy. And if anyone wants to say emphasize empathy 5 times fast, that'd be great. Didn't realize that until I tried to say that out loud. When we understand that no one is normal, we begin to listen more authentically to our neighbors, to really prioritize, how are you doing? When I first joined Sanctuary, I'm at our office location at Harrisburg United Methodist Church this evening. Our pastor at the time did a phenomenal study called I've Been Meaning to Ask, all about this emphasizing of empathy. I've been meaning to ask my neighbor, how are you? And when we emphasize this and we understand that we're all going through something, we begin to act more compassionately towards each other. And this can really make all the difference. The 3, good, make sure that this isn't missed. These are the 3 that consistently come up the most, of why people are hesitant, or they try something and then they come back to me and they're like, that was the worst mistake I've ever made, I'm never going back. And we have a long conversation about it. The first is gendered language. And this one can be very difficult because we have tons of liturgy and we have tradition and we have, our theology of a triune God and all of these different things. But being mindful about the many ways that we can talk about things. Names of God, divinity, men, women, male, female. My best example of this is the really harsh truth, especially when it comes to religious trauma, is that many terrible things are done in the name of Jesus Christ. And I have personally, experienced with my clients their stories of horrible trauma that was done and then invoked in the name of Jesus. And it's difficult for them to come back into a church, even though they believe in our Savior, to sit in a church and hear what a friend we have in Jesus 6 times. Even though while they're sitting there, and this is work that they're doing with myself in psychotherapy, trying to wrestle with difference there, how this church is saying it versus how they've experienced it. But this is really important for us to think about. If we say it one way, can we say it another way? Can we be more inclusive about how we're talking about our Savior, our Lord, God, Mother, Father, all of these kind of things? And some of my clients may never recover some of the words that were used in their trauma, but it does not mean that they cannot find an abundant, joyful life with God. It just may be under different words than you or I are using. Being mindful, some clients that are very empowered are open to talking to leadership about this if they feel comfortable hearing what they have to say. I had a client once tell me one of the most impactful things, they entered a relationship that they needed with a Stephen minister. And in a card that the Stephen minister sent, they wrote Abba instead of Father. Knowing my client's particular use of religious terms. And she said, I will never get rid of this card. This was the first time that I have ever felt seen in my new reconstruction of my faith. The second is that nothing is required. I'll never forget, this is a story of my own experience of joining a church when I was in I think I was like 21. I moved to Minnesota and I visited a church for the first time, and they had a wonderful greeter there that was like, let's, get you a name tag. Here you go, put on the name tag. We sat down and I was looking around and I realized my name tag was a different color than everyone else's. And you want to know why? Was that then the director of welcome something, I don't even remember what it was called. I think I've purposely tried to blank it out of my mind. Looked at me and was like, we have a guest. And everyone turned to me and they were like, stand, tell us about yourself. No, I want to sit in this pew. And I don't. I am a terrible introvert. I could have melted in the pew. And some people get up there and this is great. And this is hospitality, right? Like, we want to welcome people into our churches. Of course we do. We don't want to be, no one. But oftentimes, and I've experienced this very often being a young person in church communities. I come to a church once and somebody hands me a clipboard and says, you would be great to sign up for Room in the Inn next week. And it's like, oh, yeah, sure. Now, I don't have a good amount of religious trauma or experience that way, other than that one experience of standing up and introducing myself. I will never forget that for the rest of my life. But this can really trigger people with religious trauma. Because many of the people that I know that leave what we call cult-ish, not true cults, but cult-ish religion, everything is required. They don't get to have a lot of free will when it comes to religious organizations. Some people may be very timid to join something if they've just left a church that has crumbled underneath them. They need a place that they can be and start to feel comfortable. We can sometimes, with the best intentions, come in so hot for people, even though we just want them to know that we are here for them. We want them part of our community. But being able to invite people and say, this is an open invitation. No pressure. We'd love to have you, but it's okay if you can't make it. It can make a world of difference. People that are trying to figure out, does this place feel safe? It may not yet, but it could one day. The other one is small connections. This is something I know a lot of our congregations are working on. Big groups can often spark traumatized behaviors. Mostly because when we start to put a lot of people in a room, that little curly Q yellow system starts to think, am I safe? Is this good? Are we okay? And the person either misses everything that happened in that large group because they dissociate out of safety, or they can have a reaction that they're not fully in control of because they don't feel quite safe. We can find time to have small connections, small conversations with people without it feeling confrontational. Many of my clients remark that they really, really appreciate when one person comes up and says, I haven't seen you here before. My name is, it's so nice to have you with us today. And that's it. Small connection. One of my clients shared with me one time when I added this to my presentation that after visiting a church twice, one person talked to them, but then brought them into a large group, and it was like, "Congrats, you were our new member class." And she's like, "I didn't even say I was going to join." And she's like, I immediately just got angry. I was frustrated. I said things I didn't mean. Like, and she's like, it was just out of my control at that point. She's like, I can never go back there again. Like, I acted a way that I'm not proud of, things like that. Small connections, being mindful before bringing someone into this larger group that could really ignite their need for safety. Oh, and this is maybe the hardest. We talk about, I talked about common threads or connections. And my favorite thing that I, at some point, hear from, most individuals are this phrase at some point, especially in religious trauma. We talk about this process of deconstruction and then reconstruction. And for anyone who would like to learn more about that, you can always contact me, and I can go over that process. That was not part of our presentation today. And this phrase commonly gets spoken. And it's one that can be really challenging for us who have a pretty steady faith in what we know God is. But for many people that I see that have experienced religious trauma, there is a breaking away of the God that they were told about and a God that they start to believe in and call their own savior. The first may not affirm who they are as a person at all. That God would have changed everything about them if they could. But the God that they are starting to believe in loved them for exactly who they were. So this phrase comes up a lot, and it can sometimes shock us. So I often call this part attending and staying present when we're experiencing shock. So the truth is, as I talked about earlier, terrible things happen in this world. By being a trauma-informed congregation, by inviting people of diverse backgrounds to come here, you will hear terrible things that have happened in this world. And that can be really hard for us to sit with. These are the two things that I offer as suggestions when we find ourselves in that place. The first is not offering placating words. Our human response is always to say something hopeful, like it'll get better, God is with you. And all of those things may be very true. But in that moment, is to just be with them. I often talk with Stephen ministers about using the phrase, like, in this moment, what's something that could be helpful for you? Some people will say, can you pray with me? Some people will say, can you just sit? Can I have a hug? Can I just be? If I had a nickel for this is probably the biggest skill that I work on with people of we can be experiencing such uncomfortable feelings and want to make that so much better for people. And it is not a terrible instinct, but it's also ours to be able to hold on to hope and give it when the person is ready. And it may not be at that moment. I talk to people a lot about attending to this shock. Some of even the things that I've shared that clients have shared with me this evening may have filled you with some shock or horror. Me too, first time that I heard them. And instead of saying, well, it's going to get better, handing that hope off, like that video said, we need hope. But it's being able to hold it and give it in the right time. The other one is when you are experiencing people that are coming to you, especially with religious and relational trauma, is quickly doing what I like to call the copy paste. Cut, copy, paste. Well, we never do that in my church. Someone shares, my church, this happened with this committee or things like that. And immediately we're like, my church is the greatest. And we would never do that at my church. We can't promise that. We cannot promise that. Often, people will share something, when I'm in my sessions, and they'll share something about the God that they know. And in the back of my head, I'm like, that is not a God I know. That is so far from my theology. It's okay. But I'm not trying to copy and paste, like, I don't hand my clients, deconstructing the John Wesley sermon book and go, this is the way. I love John Wesley, but attending to, instead of replacing theology, being curious. One way that we do this as a congregation is seeking curiosity together. It's okay to say, you know what, I don't know. Or, ooh, that sounds, like a terrible thing to happen at your church. I hope ours is, not like that. I mean, we all know our churches have something to offer, but being careful that we're not handing it out like a solution. Our church may do something that could really put some people off, as well as do something that could help people as well. I love our churches and our communities, but being mindful that they are not perfect. And especially when we talk about this from a theology perspective, I often talk to pastors about this. If we let someone reconstruct and create their own faith, it is 10 times stronger than me pasting over something that has hurt them. That's not going to bring them to a closer relationship with God. It's just going to be a Band-Aid. And here is the truth. There is hope. Like I said, holding on to it sometimes, even if they're not ready to take it. The first one that I hold on hope, and I truly see divinity, God's gift shining through all three of these, because all three things of these are true. The first is that the brain heals. This is the most fascinating thing about the brain, more than any other part of the human body. Its plasticity, its ability to heal. Many of you may have friends or loved ones that have experienced a variety of incidents, from traumatic brain injuries to strokes, things like that. The ability for the brain to heal from those traumatic medical events is nothing short of astonishing sometimes. The same is true for this internal system. Some of these that I talk to people about, there's 2 advanced trauma techniques. The first is EMDR. These are done by licensed clinical therapists. The first is EMDR, and the second is known as brain spotting. I'm trained in brain spotting. And the fact is, when I introduce this to people, no matter what, it sounds made up. It is very interesting. EMDR uses light, sometimes touch, and really bringing people back into key trauma memories. Brain spotting works a little bit different using the occipital nerve. And they're both wild. When I learned about these, when I became trained in them, I was like, there is no way that this works. And it does. It works miracles for people. And for me, that is a sure sign that God is with us, because there is no way that these things work without God already knowing that these things are going to happen to our brain and Him saying, you know what, I need to make a failsafe for that. I need to find a way to help my creation heal. And I thank God every day for that. The second is that community is key. Dr. Van der Kolk spoke about this in his video. What we know about trauma is that the community aspect, the relational aspect, is so important to the healing process, that people don't feel isolated and alone in their pain, that they have people that can support them, love them, and care for them as they are going through this sometimes long healing process. And that's where this community steps in. People that want to be trauma informed and say, you have a safe place here. We want to be there for you. The final one, as always, we are not alone in doing this. There's definitely moments in my career, in my time, that I've thought, I don't know what to do next. And surely as I think those thoughts, God is there with the next word, the next action, or moment of silence to give hope. There is healing. Well, I want to thank everybody. I'm going to turn it over to Katie to kind of moderate questions that may have come in and things like that, and for us to be able to have some time for questions and answers as we wrap up this evening.
There was only one question that I've seen in the chat, and that was when you were talking about the brain chemistry and all that. I think that's when it was. But somebody asked, do most addicts, drug or alcohol, have trauma that may have caused it?
It is pretty specific. It's hard to know. Drug and alcohol, there are tons of psychological theories about what causes this. There is a genetic link. There is a social learning link. It is pretty complicated as far as things. And I think this is where it's hard. Do drug abusers and alcoholics experience trauma? Yes. Is the reason that they turn to these substances always trauma? No. Not always. And that can be, challenging to kind of parse out. I would say I'm not a licensed alcohol specialist. I actually work with Al-Anon, with supporting individuals who, because something that is very true is that alcoholics and drug abusers typically can cause quite a lot of trauma to their family members. And that is typically where my work with them begins. I typically, a lot of the time with people who are actively using, we have wonderful resources in licensed alcohol specialists and drug specialists that work with these individuals. But I think it can kind of be this, chicken or the egg, things like that. Hard to know kind of the scenario, and is very, very personal.
Mm-hmm. We just got another question. Can a trauma be so severe to cause a mental change to the extent of like schizophrenia or something like that?
Yes, it is possible. And it goes back to, is it just the trauma that caused this, or, is there a genetic link, things like that, also possible. But yes, in some cases, we do see trauma responses so severe that they mimic or become other psychological diagnoses. We call these people dual diagnosed, and typically need support not only for that trauma, but also for now the other set of needs that they have in that specific area.
Another question. What would you suggest are some ways in which congregations could equip or train their parishioners, those amongst them, to respond to individuals? I mean, obviously attend this training, but are there other ways that our participants could take back to their congregations?
Mm-hmm. I think a big part, yes, attend this training. If you have access to the recording, share it. But the other ways, I really encourage trainings for congregations that are on active listening, that are on compassion, really teaching congregations to really practice empathetic listening. I myself do some of these trainings with congregations. I know others in our connection do as well. But this is a huge first step for congregations, is just learning to not make assumptions and learning how to listen first before acting. And when we want to become trauma-informed congregations, this is the first step, is understanding that how common it is a big stumbling block for a lot of congregations that I've worked with, one. And then the second is, okay, how do we start actually listening and responding with empathy to individuals in our congregation and community?
How could this information that you've shared help us work with the homeless population?
I think a big part of that is actually what I just spoke to about, a really key part of the homeless population. Disproportionately a large amount of our homeless population in the United States are veterans. And it is very likely that many of them have seen active combat. And being able to attend to any person who is experiencing homelessness with a lot of compassion and not making assumptions for their reasons for homelessness, things like that. Being able to open our doors, our hearts to these people and listen. When I was helping in youth ministry, I think the most impactful thing I actually ever heard from a homeless man in DC, shared with myself and the youth that I had taken with me there, that he said, the most beautiful thing people could give me is eye contact. So often people, when they pass me on the street, they look away from me. They don't make eye contact, even when I'm in the serving line at Room in the Inn, that people just don't even look at me, not in the eyes. And I think that right there shows, one of the greatest things that we can do to be trauma informed is to see people as people.
Powerful. Will you be sharing your slide deck?
Sure. If Katie will tell me how, I would be more than happy to.
Yeah, we will. So following you get an email from Havilah, who's our conference resource person, after tonight, and in which she'll share some information about follow-up, but we'll make sure we get Catherine's slide deck and make that available to you all as well, if she's willing to share it, which sounds like she is. So that's all the questions that were in there in the chat that I saw. If you posted one and I missed it, feel free to write it again. I'm not seeing anything. Well, Catherine's gonna, like I said, in the follow-up email that you will get from Havilah, we'll have her contact information in there. So if you have follow-up questions, and things like that, you can get in touch with her that way. So be on the lookout for that with Havilah, with all sorts of information on this workshop and other workshops throughout the week on how you can stay engaged and get more information.
Thank you all so much for joining me this evening. I really appreciate everybody being here, and I look forward to hopefully seeing you all throughout this year.
Catherine, I missed some of it because I'm at work tonight. And then I'm full-time in a hospital, and then part-time, my husband and I have a parish together. So one of the things that it struck me, and I don't know if this is something that you've seen before, I participated some with another denomination before I became Methodist, and then also with in Greenville, South Carolina, with When Faith Hurts, done by their women and trauma sex center. I can't remember the name. It's a Lutheran pastor and lawyer that comes and does that every year. But one of the things we noticed the first year is there were very few senior pastors and very few men. And when I looked at this, when I started this, and it may just be coincidence because it's lay people and clergy, but I was struck by how many women were in this group tonight.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Yeah.
Just a comment, just an aside.
It can definitely be, a factor. And I mean, we're experiencing it, just in the psychotherapy field as well. Who are we seeing be trained in advanced trauma techniques, really stepping out and willing to do that work, predominantly women. I would say from my experience, now there are always, people of different gender identity, attending our trainings, but it's a lot. It's fascinating though, because, we were, a good friend of mine are both brain spotting therapists, and I'm part of a connectional group here in Charlotte. And most of us are women, but the founder of brain spotting identifies as a man. And, a lot of his first disciples were, and we've seen this shift in psychotherapy where really the fathers and the disciples of many of these movements were men, but the field is now predominantly women.
But especially like with language and stuff like that, if pastors, if preachers are not using pastoral care in their sermons, and there's some things that we can do pastorally that you mentioned tonight, so many things that you mentioned tonight that we can actually do even from the pulpit to make a difference. And it's just a statement. I don't know, it's more anecdotal than anything else, but just
welcome. And I think, there's always, hope that we're continuing as clergy to do continuing education as well, not just this conference, but others, to hopefully, encourage people to think about that. And wonderful that so many people joined us this evening. Could have been.
Yeah, there were a lot on here. I mean, that was great. There was a lot on here, but that was just something I was curious about. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for joining us, Laura Lee.